On the western edge of Bryant Park's Great Lawn, close to 6th Avenue, there's a plaque, black and gold, listing the donors who renovated the park. It sits on a wooden platform. The platform is split down the middle. It opens. It's an emergency exit hatch for staff working in the library directly below, 17 feet under the grass, in a climate-controlled vault holding 2.5 million books on 37 miles of shelving. The people eating lunch above it are standing on the roof of a library they're not allowed to enter. Below that first level is a second, 27 feet down. It wasn't finished when the first level opened in 1991. It sat as an unlit hollow for 24 years. When it was finally completed in 2015, it was named after a donor. The door through which only a few dozen authorized staff are permitted to pass is marked with red and yellow arrows on the floor. There is no public map for what's down there. The question that raises is not complicated. Why does the most democratic institution in American civic life have a floor no member of the public has ever seen? The answer is in a document most people have never heard of. In 1895, Carnegie's secretary, James Bertram, wrote the official specifications for the library program that would build 1,679 public buildings across the United States. His requirement was unambiguous. The buildings should be devoted exclusively to the housing of books and their issue for home use. Books in the patrons' hands, readers among the shelves. That was the founding principle of the American Public Library. Written down, distributed to every town that applied for funding, enforced in every building Carnegie paid for. That same year, Dr. John Shaw Billings, the man Carnegie himself publicly named as the architect of the finest library in America, sketched the design for the New York Public Library on a scrap of paper. 7 floors of closed iron stacks, accessible only to staff, topped by a reading room elevated 3 stories above the street, served by what Billings called the most rapid delivery system in the world. Not the most open, the most rapid. No patron would ever enter those stacks. The books would come up to the public. The public would never go down to the books. Here's the conflict. Stated plainly, the man who required open stacks in every library he funded held up a permanently closed stack institution as the national standard every other library should aspire to reach. The democratic principle and the locked door were written in the same year, endorsed by the same man, and neither one was ever reconciled with the other. That's one question. Here's a harder one. If the flagship institutions were built with their books underground and inaccessible from the beginning, if that was the design, not a later compromise, then what exactly was the American Public Library built to do? And what's on the floor that still has no map? If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. The Carnegie program, at the level most people experienced it, was a genuine revolution. The specifications were plain: main floor for books and reading, basement for lectures and the heating plant, open stacks, clear sightlines, one librarian at a central desk who could see everything. The whole design was built around the idea that the books and the people were in the same room, and that any person who walked through the door had the right to walk among the shelves and take what they wanted. In many small American towns, the Carnegie Library was the largest public building ever constructed there. It was also the first building in town where that principle applied. The research on this spans construction documents, renovation records, and architectural histories from 5 American library systems across 130 years of building decisions. The pattern is in all of them. Dr. John Shaw Billings was not a librarian by training. He was a military surgeon, the man who built the National Library of Medicine, who served as a medical inspector for the Union Army during the Civil War. When the trustees of the New York Public Library recruited him as their first director in 1895, he produced a design on a scrap of paper that became the blueprint for the most celebrated library building in America. A grand reading room, elevated 3 stories above street level, sitting on top of 7 floors of closed iron stacks. Billings's stated goal was speed. He wanted the fastest book delivery system in the world. The New York Public Library's main branch opened on May 23, 1911. More than 1 million books were in place. President Taft presided at the ceremony. Between 30,000 and 50,000 visitors came through the first day. The first reader filed a request at 9:08 in the morning. The book arrived 6 minutes later. That was the triumph. 6 minutes. The fastest in the world. But that patron at 9:08 couldn't have browsed for what he wanted. The stacks were below him, behind iron, inaccessible to anyone without a staff key. He had needed to know the book's exact catalog number before he could file the slip. To find the catalog number, he had used the card catalog in a separate room. The 6-minute delivery was only available to people who already knew what they were looking for, who had come in knowing the author, the title, and how the system worked. For anyone who walked in without that knowledge, the fastest library in the world had nothing to offer faster than a card index. The first book requested that morning was an obscure Russian philosophical tract, the Grotz Study of Nietzsche and Tolstoy. The reader knew its exact catalog number. That level of specificity is only possible in a closed stack system. You cannot browse for what you cannot see. This wasn't peculiar to New York. It was the architecture of every large American library built in this period, and it went much deeper than most accounts describe. In 1875, Librarian of Congress Ainsworth Rand Spofford reported to Congress that the Library of Congress had exhausted its shelf space entirely. More than 70,000 books were, in his exact words, being piled on the floor in all directions. Members of Congress who came to use the library could barely find room to work. His warning was specific. If Congress didn't act, he would soon be presiding over the greatest chaos in America. Here's what that crisis produced, and what it didn't. The Jefferson Building opened in 1897. The Washington Post said there was no building in America that could compare with it. 9 floors of closed iron stacks inside a marble structure modeled on the Paris Opera House. The chaos of books on the floor was solved by putting the books underground, behind locked iron, accessible only to staff. A quarter-mile tunnel was built beneath First Street connecting the building to the Capitol, carrying books to senators at 600 feet per minute by an electric chain apparatus. Spofford had warned of the greatest chaos in America. The answer was a retrieval machine of extraordinary precision, and a patron who still couldn't enter the shelves. A cellar floor plan for the Jefferson Building, showing alterations made between 1938 and 1960, is archived in the library's own collection. The access note reads, "Original material served by appointment only." The tunnel was destroyed in 2008. Not preserved, not repurposed. Demolished to make room for the Capitol Visitor Center. The electric book apparatus that carried volumes at 600 feet per minute through a quarter-mile of underground passage was replaced by a pedestrian hallway. There is a Subway sandwich shop in the tunnel that remains. 1 year before the Jefferson Building opened, 22 miles north in Boston, the McKim Building of the Boston Public Library opened with the words, "Free to all," carved into its exterior stone. Those words came from Joshua Bates, the financier whose donation established the library in 1852. His specific condition for the gift: warm, well-lit, space for 150 patrons, and free to all. Architect Charles Follen McKim called it a palace for the people. Inside, closed stacks. Patron requests sent through a pneumatic tube system. Books returned along a book railway, an adaptation of the cash delivery system used by Boston department stores to move money between sales counters and a central office. The Lamson Consolidated Store Service Company, which installed Boston's book railway, had built the same system for retailers first. The library's retrieval mechanism was retail logistics adapted for knowledge. Because patrons had to wait for their requests to be fulfilled, McKim wanted to give them something to look at. He asked his friend Edwin Austin Abbey to fill the delivery room with paintings. Abbey painted the quest for the Holy Grail across the walls: full panels, knights, forests, medieval light. The room built for waiting became one of the most ornate interiors in America. The pneumatic tubes in the book railway are no longer operational. The Boston Public Library notes this on its own website. Staff are on hand to retrieve items from the closed stacks. The word retrieve is still there. It hasn't changed in 130 years. The books are somewhere the patron isn't. Someone else goes to get them. The beautiful room was always the waiting room. Carnegie's open stack branches were designed so one librarian could see everything in the room. The flagship institutions he held up as models were designed so no patron could see anything below the reading room floor. The first 5 Carnegie libraries used closed stacks. When Carnegie switched to open stacks in the Pittsburgh neighborhood branches, Starting with Lawrenceville in the early 1900s, he did it specifically to reduce operating costs. One librarian instead of several. The democratic benefit was real. It was also an efficiency measure. What's worth noting is which institutions adopted the new model, and which didn't. The small-town Carnegie branches went open. The large research libraries, the ones with the deepest sub-basements, the most books, the longest retrieval tunnels, stayed the way Billings drew them. The reform reached the town library and stopped at the door of the institution that held everything worth finding. Carnegie cited the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore as his model in the gospel of wealth. The best in America, he called it. Pratt was free, open to all citizens regardless of property or color. That language was Pratt's own founding condition. During World War II, the Pratt Library sub-basement was officially designated as an air raid shelter. The designation is in the library's own historical timeline. The sub-basement was useful for sheltering people from bombing, precisely because it was deep underground, structurally reinforced and sealed from the street. Those are the same qualities that made it a restricted floor. The best library in America had a bunker under it from the day it opened. The war just gave the bunker a second function. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people. In 1912, the St. Louis Central Library opened with a stack tower inside it. 7 stories of iron and glass with glass floors at each level. Light fell from the top floor down through each successive level. From the bottom, you could look up through 7 stories of shelving. The iron frames receding overhead in a column of light. Pneumatic tubes carried request slips from the reading hall to the stacks. Books returned to the patron. The patron never entered. In 2010, renovation plans called for demolishing the tower to create a new atrium. Preservation advocates argued the glass floors were irreplaceable. The tower was demolished. The nearest surviving example of glass-floored library stacks was identified at the time as Jacksonville, Illinois. The St. Louis Library now has more classrooms and meeting spaces. The thing that made it singular is gone. Here's what holds across every one of these buildings. The lower you go, the fewer people have ever been there. The reading room is public. The main stack level is restricted. The sub-basement has no visitor map. In every case, the label applied to the deepest floor is a functional one. Mechanical plant, cellar, sump. That names what the space does, not who it excludes. The restriction doesn't appear in the label. It appears in the architecture. It was built that way. The New York Public Library's cellar contains the granite walls of the Croton Reservoir. The reservoir was built in 1842, a 50-foot-tall above-ground water vault holding 20 million gallons of drinking water, demolished in 1900 to make room for the library. Its foundations were not removed. They were incorporated. The library was built directly on top of the water infrastructure that preceded it. The basement corridors pass by stonework from the reservoir. The NYPL's own documentation notes it in the lower level of the South Court. Knowledge built on a water vault, held underground, I delivered upward on request, to a room made beautiful enough that the people above never thought to ask what was below. Now look at what the dates show. Bertram's open stack specifications, 1895. Billings's closed stack sketch, 1895. Library of Congress opens with a tunnel to the Senate, and stacks no patron enters, 1897. Boston Public Library opens with free to all on the exterior, and a book railway in the basement, 1895. Carnegie's town libraries begin mandating open stacks, 1903 onward. The large institutions don't follow. 1991, Bryant Park excavated, a second level dug beneath the first, left unfinished. 2008, the Capitol Tunnel destroyed. 2012, NYPL trustees propose moving 1 million books to a New Jersey warehouse. 2 lawsuits stop it. 2015, the second level under Bryant Park finally lit, finally shelved, named after a donor. But every time the question of access came up, the answer was more underground, not less. The reform reached the town library. It never reached the floor that held the most. There's no record of a meeting where this was decided. No document where someone weighed access against restriction and chose restriction. What there is instead is a logic that was never questioned. More books require more storage. The most efficient storage is below ground. Below ground storage is necessarily controlled. The question of whether efficient and accessible were the same thing never appeared in the construction documents. The sub-basement shows up in every building plan without a notation for who cannot enter. The restriction wasn't hidden. It wasn't labeled either. It was structural. It was the building itself. Billings died in March 1913. He had undergone 8 surgeries in his final years. His wife had died the year before. He was buried with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. He never heard anyone ask whether the 6-minute delivery was the right question, whether speed was actually the problem that needed solving. The book arrived in 6 minutes. The system worked. Nobody went looking for the floor that wasn't on the map. The scrap of paper sketch, the one that became the blueprint for the most famous library building in the country, showed a reading room elevated on top of 7 floors of locked stacks. The elevation was structural. The stacks held up the floor. The people sat on top of the books. The emergency exit hatch in Bryant Park opens onto a level 27 feet below the lawn. Above it, people sit in the sun. The books below them are held at 65 degrees. Some of them have not been requested in decades. The room at the top was built to be beautiful. The room at the bottom was built to last. The difference between those two goals is the history of who the American Library was actually built for. And the answer is still underground, in a vault with no public map, below a park where no one is looking down.